Okay, let me get my social media set up here. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to C3. Welcome to another one of our uh, Facebook teachings. And I guess, first of all, title for today is Toward a Third Way Consciousness. And I say toward a third way consciousness, not because um, I have some secret, or by the end of this, we'll all merge into some third way of being, but because I think it's important to host a conversation like this. And something like this is attractive and has been building sort of in me as a desire to talk about. Let's talk about third way. And I first heard that phrase from Thich Nhat Hanh, which I'll refer to in a few minutes. So that's kind of where we're going. And welcome, everybody, C3 people. It's good to see your little responses, and welcome, Instagram people. Couple notes for C3 regulars or people who have found their way to C3 through the internet. Go to our website, c3westmichigan.org, and sign up for our newsletter if you want to stay more connected. And if you get the newsletter, read the newsletter. It's amazing to me how much is really going on even during this pandemic, and the numerous ways you can connect to C3 and to our values and how we're trying to live them out. So anyway, sign up for the newsletter, read the newsletter. Um, for example, we've had an ongoing March for Peace in Holland. That's worth checking out. It's growing. It's not just C3 people. So that's just one tiny example of things that are going on in our community. So anyway, just another plug for the newsletter. If you're new to this format, I talk for about 20, 30 minutes, something like that. And then you can stay on the C3 page and I hand it over to the musician. I repost our musician each week. This week it's Sandra Effort, so we're really pleased that she's willing to uh, do her own Facebook Live thing. And it's really important that we try in our own small way to support our local musicians. We always have supported local musicians, and now more than ever, when they don't have work, they don't have regular musician work, it's not possible. So the small contribution we can make to supporting local music and local art, local expressions, really, I think is important. So thank you for supporting C3, those of you who do it on a regular basis. We could not do this without you. It matters, you matter, and that's enough, I think, in terms of advertising for C3. By the way, Patty is saying on the Facebook feed, there's also a Vigil for Peace. There's also one in Grand Haven besides the one in Holland. So anyway, that's why you should read the newsletter. Okay, so toward a third way. So here's my introductory quotation from Thich Nhat Hanh. We are here to awaken from our illusion of separateness. One of the things I love about Thich Nhat Hanh is that he has such clarity and simplicity with his words. So I want to say it again. We are here to awaken from our illusion of separateness. To him, that's like the meaning of life. What's the meaning of life? To awaken from our illusion of separateness. If you don't know Thich Nhat Hanh, he is a Vietnamese Buddhist who first came into public consciousness during the Vietnam War when he and others stood up in mostly silent but peaceful protests in Vietnam. He was exiled from his own country for many years and lived in America and in France. Martin Luther King Jr. Nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. So that's a little bit of Thich Nhat Hanh. He has been teaching people around the world the benefits of mindfulness and meditation and presence and nonviolent action in the world. And I first heard the phrase third way from him. And I'll try to, here at the beginning, give my own definition for what I think is meant by third way consciousness or the emergence of the third way. And really, this is from my own sort of understanding. So you'll have to forgive. You have to forgive me. I'm not quoting anyone here. So the way I think about third way consciousness is something like this: holding the tension of opposites long enough for a third path to emerge. And like with Thich Nhat Hanh, holding North and South Vietnam, North and South in its complexities, in its humanness, for some third alternative to emerge. So not dispelling, not shaming, not pushing away, not dividing the world up, but holding the tension of opposites long enough for some third path to emerge. And that's not the same thing as compromise. It's actually the emergence of something new. Compromise is important too. But that's like, okay, you get a little of this and I'll take a little of this and we'll sort of, we'll compromise and move forward. The third way says something like hold the tension of opposites without running, without fleeing, without dispelling, without scapegoating, and see what happens. Now, first question, who is talking like this? Who is talking like this in the public sphere? Who's talking like this on your Facebook feed? Who's talking like this on your Instagram feed? Who's talking like this in the news media? Nobody. Nobody. It's not part of the public conversation. What I'm calling third way here. It's about division, separation, rightness, wrongness, other, againstness, protesting on either side, separation, division. Hardly anybody is saying there's value in holding the tension of opposites. There's value in holding up the person and what they have to say of someone you disagree with and who you think is opposed to you. Hardly anybody speaking like this. And that makes sense, because when fear is the governing vibe, I guess is the best way to say it. When fear is the governing milieu, then division, separation, division, separation is what happens when fear is the operating principle. And there are a lot of reasons to be fearful right now. Our American democracy is, the mask has been pulled off. We're feeling our own fragility. We're feeling our own impermanence in a much more visceral way. We're watching the number of people who continue to die from the coronavirus increase each day. In other words, we're facing our absolute and utter vulnerability. And there aren't enough weapons in the world. We're the most weaponized country on earth to protect us from this invisible virus. So we're feeling our own fragility and our own vulnerabilities. And it's very quick to go to the finger pointing. And you know that, I know that, I'm not even saying something new. I've engaged in my own finger pointing. I'm sure you have too. It's a natural kind of part of our reactivity. But what I think Thich Nhat Hanh is, he's ringing a bell, like his meditation bell, and he's calling us toward a higher, um, more mature way of being in the world, more mature consciousness in the world. After all, let me give you his meaning of life again. We are here to awaken from our illusion of separateness. And think about how many things are feeling like separateness. Black and white, nature and human, male and female, rich and poor, the developed world, the third world, urban and rural, left and right. You know, those two, how everything is being split up into these two opposing sides. And if Thich Nhat Hanh is correct, and I think he is, the division of the world is an illusion. It's an illusion. But that's not quite the same thing as saying there's no value in right and left, for example. It's saying that there's something like an illusion of separateness that keeps these things at the poles. And if we can hold the poles long enough, a kind of third consciousness can emerge, and a more profound and connected way of being in the world might be born. I think that's what he's getting at. So, yeah, so a few thoughts along these lines. I'd like to maybe say a few things about what third way is not. And actually, I first heard Richard Rohr say something about what the third way is not. And he says, which I think is important, he says the third way consciousness is not relativism. It's not, hey, your truth is your truth, and my truth is my truth. And in other words, no one has a handle on the truth. And we can't say, I can't actually say if you're wrong, and you can't actually say if I'm wrong. That the truth itself is relative. That's not quite the same thing. In fact, the cultural pressures of right now, this month, June, are revealing the limitations of such a thing. No one would say of police brutality, well, it's, well, very few would, I might add. It's just a matter of perspective. We don't, that's their truth. We need to honor their truth. And the other side has its version of the truth. That's relativism. That tries to eliminate all truth claims, and we end up with kind of nihilism. And so that's not third way thinking. It's kind of like you've heard me pick on kind of this postmodern loop before, which is something like there is no absolute truth, which is an absolute claim, so it sort of falls in on itself. So the gift, we might say, of what is emerging as postmodern consciousness might be something like, I just named the curse, the dark side, but the gift might be something like, all perspectives are limited, including my own. All perspectives are limited. I don't see with 100% clarity. And we could say no one sees with 100% clarity, so we need one another. We need to be in conversation with one another. We need to hold the poles. We can't live, part of the problem with the political divides right now is that it almost feels like if I could just eliminate the other side and get them out of the picture, control the Senate, the White House, the Senate, the Congress, the judicial system, then I don't have to deal with the segment of the population that I don't agree with. And worse than that, I don't think has the right to be an American. That's not the way democracy works. But that's kind of the train of both sides, right and left, Democrat and Republican. That's the train that they've all hopped on. Um, there's very little value even in saying anymore, I'm a person that listens. I'm a person that wants to understand the truths that the other side is holding that I cannot yet see. Who talks like that? I mean, especially in the political sphere, nobody talks like that. And that's why we're in such dire straits, we could say. Um, so I want to offer a few sort of hints and guesses toward a cultivation or at least a conversation with the sorts of things that I'm talking about here. So I think the first thing that is important to say is that we have some responsibility to identify the opposites and what they are, rather than pretend they're not there. No, identify the opposites. Identify the opposing positions and try to get clear about them, and try to get clear about what's underneath them, and try to get clear emotionally about what's underneath various perspectives. It is important to identify that opposites exist. And even things that in our culture right now that we might say are good and wholesome and worth holding on to, and values and American ideals, let's get clear about those, and let's get clear about the unpleasant things. Let's admit, like I talked about last week, our own racism and bigotry and ways in which power has consolidated around certain people and certain zip codes. Let's say that's also true. It's not one or the other. It's, yes, we have values and ideals that we don't always live up to, and we don't live up to them. And society is structurally unfair. We can say such a thing. And life is also unfair. And that's the holding of the poles. It's saying both of these things exist. And if I can courageously stand between these forces, what might emerge? Instead of running to one side or the other, or clinging to one side or the other, or worse, dispelling and dispensing and eliminating and scapegoating, which is a very human and natural tendency. The other thing I might add here is not only is it important to identify the opposites out there, so to speak, I think it's maybe more challenging and more poignant to also turn that gaze inward. Now, that's often what I'm encouraging people to do. If you listen to my talks and podcasts and teaching, writing, and turn the gaze inward. And I need such a thing. Not that I'm like some kind of expert, but to do, like I've been saying for a while, something like a searching spiritual inventory or a searching moral inventory, to use the 12-step language, which is such opposites exist within me. My own goodness and my own darkness. I think the closer we get to admitting my own goodness and my own darkness, I am much less likely to move out into the world and split everything up between, good and evil, between us and them, between I have the moral and philosophical high ground and they are backwoods and lower level consciousness kinds of things. That's the ego firmly in charge. So the way to not put that out there is to do the inner work, and to admit the contradictions of one's own way of being in the world. And that's not fun. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, "Hey, awesome! I'm gonna, I'm so happy to do searching spiritual inventory and bump into my own racism, bigotry, selfishness, and greed." No one likes to do such a thing. That's what makes it difficult. And when the polarizing culture has the dominant say in our life, we never get around to that because we get sucked into groups that essentially say, we are the righteous ones and they are the unrighteous ones. And everything I read confirms that bias. And the world would change if that person changes. And that's the illusion of separateness. That's what Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about. That separateness like that is an illusion. So what I'm describing, I think, requires a tremendous amount of humility. Um, uh, I want to go just a little bit further with this sort of internal landscape. And one of the things I think is it's worth saying, and maybe you've heard this quotation before, but Jung said that the healthy psyche is a democracy. The healthy psyche is a democracy. So what does he mean by that? And of course, I don't know. I can't peer into his mind, but I think he's suggesting something like this, that a healthy psyche recognizes its many parts and is not under the illusion that it's only one thing, that it's totally good or totally, depraved, that it's a complex reality. So sometimes when I'm working with people, and particularly in like back in the day when people used to do retreats and programs, remember that. Sometimes when you're out in wild places and you're doing psychological work, spiritual work, nature-based work, sometimes like the lid comes off. And people begin to experience and recognize that they're a lot more complex than they thought. And there's a lot more beauty and wholeness and goodness deep within. And there's also a lot of wounded children in there, and a lot of addicts, and a lot of escapists, and so forth and so on. I don't need to list a whole bunch of complexes, but it's kind of frightening when that door opens. One feels sort of like, whoa, I don't know myself very well, and that is the beginning of hopefully some profound transformation. So sometimes I like to use the metaphor of a village. So it's something like this in my view, that beneath the surface, there's a village down there. And the village is populated by memories and coping strategies and wounded children and addicts, and what I said before. It's also populated by some really rich archetypal gifts, like inside there's an elder, and a wild woman and a wild man, and something like a generative parent. That's using some Bill Plotkin language. There's something like a muse, and these big what used to get put on the gods and goddesses, say, of Greece, those are energies that also live within. So what's my point? There's a village down there, and a healthy psyche, and here's my point, a healthy psyche wants to be and allows a conversation to take place in the village between these seemingly separated parts. So the wounded child and the elder, for example, need to be in dialogue. And when you're talking to a wounded kid, you don't shame this, dismiss them, or put them down. You listen. And in the listening, something like a more whole way of being emerges. And so I'm taking that idea that the healthy psyche is a democracy to praise and promote the democracy that we actually live in. And if the internal landscape, if the internal village is healthy when it's talking, when it's allowing the other to be, even the parts that aren't so pretty, we can say the same is true of culture. And culture at large, that democracy, which is like kind of like not that fun of a thing, means that everybody has a seat at the table. Even people that I don't like, people that make mistakes, people who don't share my worldview. And actually, it's not the expelling of their voice that needs to happen, but the voicing of their voice that needs to happen. And that means everybody, the marginalized and those who are in power. They must be in conversation. But unless we begin to praise that, promote that, work for that, work toward that, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And just wait. I mean, I imagine you're already down the road a bit. Um, what is September, October, and November going to look like in this country in terms of dialogue, in terms of the tension of opposites? So I guess what I'm saying is something like, what responsibility can I take to be and to model the very thing I'd like to see the larger democracy be and model? Can I listen to people? You know how many times I've heard in the last few years things like, I don't know if I can even talk to so and so. And I refuse to talk to so and so. I remember when George Bush said, I refuse to talk to terrorists. And I thought, that's a bad idea. It's a bad idea, in my opinion. I remember the Israeli army used to say that to the government. We don't talk to terrorists. And what do they do full time behind the scenes? Talk to terrorists. Because you can't live in a world that denies the reality of someone else. And so maybe I'm saying something like, if we can take a few breaths and remember in the contentious landscape that we're living in that we're dealing with human beings, the dignity and worth of every human being. That's in our value statement at C3. That shines a light on when I remember that shines a light on how often I don't live into such a thing, the dignity and worth of every human being. And we can say something more. We can say something like, what truth or truths might the other actually possess that I need to hear right now, but I can't hear because I've already decided, I've already separated. That's when a few breaths are needed. Okay, my perspective is limited. The other's perspective is limited. And if we can hold the poles, rural and urban and liberal and conservative, and or I like sometimes traditional and innovative. I like these terms as poles. We need tradition and we need innovation. See, and I was just noticing Leslie talking about our language, saying something like non-binary language. This is such an interesting idea because our language itself keeps us locked in this illusion of separateness. So might we need to bring some consciousness to the way we speak about ourselves and about other people, and the kind of language we use. So is it possible to hold these poles for some third way to emerge? And maybe I want to say something meta here at the end, which is all religious traditions, spiritual traditions, psychology, evolution itself, the great myths and legends say something like this: the evolution of consciousness or change or transformation comes in crisis. And we're in a crisis. We're in a crisis of identity. As Americans, we're in a global pandemic. We're in a crisis of race that has existed for a very long time, and the bandage has been ripped off again. And I don't celebrate that. I don't want to be in the middle of a crisis, but I do want to say it's that kind of pressure that provides the liminal space of transformation, the liminal possibility of we have left one world and we don't yet know the world that we are entering. And that's when things like holding the tension of opposites becomes important. Okay. I'm going to give you one more, like, just this is a PS to my teaching. I haven't heard anybody say anything kind of radical. Maybe I don't read the right sources around politics in a while. And I was listening to the Joe Rogan podcast when I was just in Utah, and I was driving through the night, and I was like looking for something to keep me awake. And he was interviewing this guy named Brett Weinstein, and they were talking about politics. And this is what Brett said. He's a professor in some university in the Pacific Northwest. He said, "Here's an idea for the political situation. What if we had someone? We chose two people, and one was center right, and one was center left. We said, here's the team, president and vice president, and one's center right, one's center left, and they work together. And for 4 years, they're going to make decisions as a team, no matter what, except if there's some kind of immediate crisis like war, then it goes to the president. The president, just like now, can make a decision. So without involving the vice president. But that was the idea. I've not heard anybody talk like this. Center right, center left. They work together as a team. Now here's the catch. He said, and after 4 years, they switch. They switch president and vice president. And it made me laugh out loud. And I also thought, that is a good idea, especially in a world where we just don't hear any new political ideas. And that's working within the system. But what strikes me about it now, and besides an interesting idea, is that it's an example of third way consciousness, in my opinion. It's saying the right and the left have something to offer. And if we can hold it long enough and find value in the other, that doesn't mean we don't challenge things in the other. Quite the opposite. When you sit down and have that conversation, it's difficult. But those two poles, if we can hold them long enough, maybe some third, this is just a political example, sort of third way might emerge. So anyway, that's a sort of a PS to my teaching. Let me look at my notes and see if there's anything else. No, maybe I'll just end again with the quote of Thich Nhat Hanh. We are here to awaken from our illusion of separateness. And that's my hope for you today, that in your own small way, and in my small way, I can awaken from my own illusions of separateness, my own illusions of specialness, my own illusions of being right. And my hope is just the desire for some kind of third might begin to be contagious in the right kind of way. So that's what I have for you today. I just want to thank you so much for listening and for being a participant, and even for participating in your Facebook comments, and for being a part of C3. And if you're a part of our digital community, thank you. And we hope you find hints and guesses for your own journey and your own path. So wishing you well, and thanks Instagram people for also listening. And hang on the C3 page, refresh it, and we'll have Sandra Effort up next with her piano playing, whatever else she might have in store. So peace.